A powerful cyclone has carved a trail of destruction across eastern Madagascar, killing at least 31 people and devastating large parts of the country's second largest city.
Satellite imagery captured something terrifying spiraling toward Madagascar's eastern coast on February 10, 2026. A perfectly defined eye. Warm ocean temperatures near 29 degrees Celsius feeding its fury, and sustained winds screaming past 185 kilometers per hour with gusts approaching 270. Tropical Cyclone Gezani was not just approaching, it was hunting. Within hours, the storm would make landfall near Toamasina, Madagascar's second largest city, home to somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 people. This is not some remote village. Toamasina is Madagascar's primary port, the economic lifeline connecting the island nation to the outside world. And it was about to take a direct hit from one of the most powerful cyclones to strike the region in years. By the time the winds finally died down, 75% of the city's infrastructure would be damaged or destroyed. At least 31 people would be confirmed dead, 36 more seriously injured, and over 250,000 people would be classified as disaster victims by Madagascar's National Disaster Management Agency. But here's the terrifying part that transforms this from tragedy into catastrophe. Gezani wasn't alone. Just 2 weeks earlier, Cyclone Fidia had torn through the same region, killing 14 people and displacing tens of thousands. The debris hadn't been cleared. The power lines hadn't been restored. The displaced families were still living in emergency shelters when forecasters began tracking a new disturbance forming in the Indian Ocean. Madagascar wasn't recovering from a disaster. It was being pummeled by one catastrophe stacked directly on top of another. So what happens when a nation already on its knees takes a direct hit from a Category 4 equivalent cyclone? Why did the deadliest hours come not from wind or flooding, but from buildings collapsing on the people sheltering inside them? And with Gezani now crossing into the Mozambique Channel with the potential to re-strengthen and curve back toward land, is the worst already over, or just beginning? The warnings came early. Madagascar's meteorological service tracked Gezani for days as it organized over the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. Schools closed across the eastern provinces. Emergency shelters opened their doors. Over 2,740 people evacuated from coastal areas as forecasters watched the storm's trajectory with growing alarm. The conditions were textbook perfect for rapid intensification. Sea surface temperatures hovered between 28 and 29 degrees Celsius, providing endless fuel. Wind shear remained low, allowing the storm's structure to tighten into a compact, devastating engine of destruction. Satellite analysts watched a clear eye develop, the signature of a cyclone reaching peak intensity. But no amount of preparation could stop what was coming. As Gezani closed in on Tuesday evening, sea levels began rising in Toamasina's harbor. The storm surge, though modest at around 0.6 meters, combined with already high tides to push seawater into low-lying streets. Roads flooded before the cyclone even arrived. Residents who had chosen to shelter in place watched water creep under their doors and wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. Then came the wind. Sustained winds near 185 kilometers per hour slammed into the port city. Gusts exceeding 270 kilometers per hour turned debris into projectiles. Roofs ripped from buildings and cartwheeled through the air. Walls collapsed inward without warning. Windows exploded. Power poles snapped like matchsticks, their lines whipping through the darkness. Trees that had stood for decades uprooted and crashed into homes, into cars, into anything in their path. By Wednesday morning, Toamasina had no electricity. The entire city plunged into darkness, cut off from communication with the outside world. As of the latest reports, the power still hasn't been restored. The numbers emerging from Toamasina tell a story of systematic devastation. At least 31 people confirmed dead, 29 of them in Toamasina alone, with 2 more in a neighboring district. 36 people seriously injured, many with crush wounds from collapsing structures. 4 people still missing, their fates unknown beneath the rubble or swept away by floodwaters. More than 6,800 people have been displaced, forced from homes that no longer exist or are too dangerous to occupy. They crowd into schools, community centers, and government buildings, waiting for help that may be weeks away. And then there's the broader figure that captures the true scale of this disaster. Madagascar's Bureau National de Gestion des Risques et des Catastrophes reported 250,406 disaster victims. That's not displaced. That's the full scope of affected people. Families who lost property, farmers whose crops were wiped out in a single night, business owners staring at destroyed inventory and shattered storefronts, fishermen whose boats were reduced to splinters. In a nation where food security was already precarious, where the economy runs on thin margins, where many families live one bad season away from crisis, 250,000 people just had their worst fears realized. Officials say most of the deaths came from building collapses. This is the cruel mathematics of cyclone mortality in developing nations. The wind doesn't kill directly. It kills by turning inadequate structures into death traps. In a city where housing construction was never engineered for sustained winds approaching 200 kilometers per hour, where building codes are inconsistently enforced, where poverty forces families into vulnerable dwellings, the storm finds every weakness and exploits it without mercy. This is not an anomaly. This is not a freak occurrence. This is the brutal seasonal reality of life in Madagascar. Every year between November and March, the island nation lies directly in the crosshairs of the southwestern Indian Ocean's cyclone belt. Warm waters, favorable atmospheric conditions, and a massive landmass positioned perfectly to intercept storms trekking westward from their spawning grounds. Madagascar has been hit before. Cyclone Gezani in 2004 killed over 250 people. Cyclone Inawo in 2017 killed 81. Cyclone Batsirai in 2022 killed over 120. The names change, the death tolls fluctuate, but the pattern holds with merciless consistency. What makes 2026 different is the compression, the back-to-back nature of the destruction. Cyclone Phaitia struck in late January. 14 dead, tens of thousands displaced, infrastructure damaged, emergency resources depleted. Communities were still counting their losses, still burying their dead, still clearing debris from roads when Gezani's outer bands began lashing the coast. The same families, the same damaged roads, the same overwhelmed hospitals, now dealing with a second surge of casualties. The same emergency shelters, already at capacity, suddenly asked to absorb thousands more. Back-to-back disasters don't just add up, they multiply. Each cyclone compounds the vulnerability left by the one before. Infrastructure can't be rebuilt when the next storm is already forming over the horizon. Psychological resilience shatters when there's no time to grieve before the next trauma arrives. Economic recovery becomes impossible when losses stack faster than aid can arrive. As of now, Gezani has weakened after crossing Madagascar's mountainous interior. The high terrain disrupted the storm's circulation, starving it of the warm ocean energy it needed to maintain intensity. The center passed roughly 100 kilometers north of Antananarivo, the capital, triggering red alerts for flooding even as wind speeds dropped to tropical storm levels. But the danger is far from over. Gezani is now entering the Mozambique Channel, that warm corridor of water separating Madagascar from the African mainland. And warm water is rocket fuel for tropical cyclones. Forecast models show the potential for re-strengthening as the storm moves over open ocean. Some scenarios show Gezani curving back toward Madagascar's southwestern coast by next week, threatening communities that just watched the storm pass to their north. Mozambique has already issued coastal alerts. This is a nation still reeling from catastrophic flooding in recent weeks. Its emergency response stretched thin, its vulnerable populations exhausted. The prospect of a re-strengthening Gezani making a second landfall somewhere along the Mozambique Channel coastline is keeping disaster managers awake at night. The United Nations has released $3 million in emergency funds to help Madagascar cope with the immediate aftermath. Madagascar's president has visited Toamasina, posting videos of the destruction to official channels, promising government support for the recovery effort. But money and visibility cannot rebuild a city overnight. They cannot bring back the 31 who died beneath collapsed walls. They cannot restore the livelihoods of 250,000 disaster victims. And they absolutely cannot stop the next cyclone already brewing somewhere in the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. Tropical Cyclone Gezani is a reminder of a brutal truth that comfortable nations too often forget. For countries in cyclone corridors, disaster is not an event. It is a season. It is a recurring nightmare written into geography and climate, arriving with the same certainty as the turning of the calendar. And for Madagascar, that season has only just begun. November to March. 4 more months of vulnerability. 4 more months of watching satellite imagery and hoping the next spiral stays offshore.
Will Gezani re-strengthen in the Mozambique Channel? Will the same communities face destruction for the 3rd time in a single month? Will the international community mobilize meaningful support, or will Madagascar's suffering fade from headlines as quickly as it appeared? Drop your thoughts below and subscribe, because this story is still unfolding, and the next chapter could begin any day.